On the 4th of November, 1914, the British ship Endurance traversed stormy seas, heading toward the most perilous and enigmatic continent in the world, Antarctica. Aboard this vessel was a crew of 28 individuals, led by the explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton. His ambition was to accomplish what no one had achieved before, to cross the Antarctic continent on foot. You heard that correctly, friends. In an era devoid of smartphones, GPS, or modern technology, in extreme temperatures plummeting to -50 degrees Celsius on this icy continent, amidst snowstorms, Shackleton aims to traverse it from one end to the other on foot. The plan was to reach the Antarctic coast via the Weddell Sea aboard the Endurance. If you look at the map, their strategy was to land precisely at this point and commence the journey to the South Pole, continuing afterward across to the Ross Sea. In total, this expedition spanned a distance of 2,900 kilometers. If everything proceeded according to plan, it was expected to take approximately 120 days to complete. However, the plan proved profoundly flawed, and the challenges they endured were beyond imagination for both them and you, friends. On the 5th of November, 1914, the Endurance arrived at a whaling station on South Georgia Island, the last human settlement on their route. If you consult the map, this cluster of islands lies near the tip of South America, with Antarctica's protruding peninsula directly to its south, known as the Antarctic Peninsula. Adjacent to it lies the Weddell Sea, a body of water encircled on three sides by Antarctica, which prevents ice from flowing freely, resulting in a dense, permanent ice pack. The weather that day was harsh, as were the conditions in the Weddell Sea. Locals advised Shackleton to postpone the expedition, warning that proceeding in such conditions was fraught with danger. However, Shackleton insisted and pressed forward. On the 5th of December, 1914, the Endurance continued its advance, only for their worst fears to materialize swiftly. The ice in the Weddell Sea was heavier and denser than anticipated, yet Shackleton persisted. By the 18th of January, 1915, after navigating along the ice edges for some time, the ship became entirely trapped. A few days later, some crew members spotted a 15-foot crack in the ice 50 meters from the ship, their last hope for liberation. For 3 hours, the ship was driven at full engine speed in an attempt to break free from the ice, but it did not budge an inch. Crew members descended from the ship and attempted to break the ice with the tools they had, but their efforts were in vain. Gradually, the ice floe in which the ship was trapped drifted farther from land. The point in Antarctica where the crew had planned to land was called Weddell Bay, but the ship was drifting ever farther away, eventually reaching a distance of 60 miles. The problem was that open water separated the ice floe from Weddell Bay, preventing the crew from simply disembarking and walking to the bay. Meanwhile, the ship remained stuck in the ice. Weeks and months passed as they tried to free the Endurance. They knew winter was approaching, and in Antarctica, winter meant 24 hours of darkness. For weeks and months, they would not see a single minute of sunlight. Shackleton ordered everyone to winter aboard the ship. However, winter meant even colder temperatures, snowfall, and blizzards. The ship was under increasing pressure from the surrounding ice. A photographer, Frank Hurley, was aboard with his camera, capturing images that vividly depict how the ice encircling the Endurance was crushing it. By the 30th of September, 1915, cracks were visible on the ship, yet the crew did not lose hope. On the 24th of October, 1915, at 6:45 in the evening, the immense pressure suddenly caused the ice floe to break and a fragment struck the ship. A heavy piece of ice shattered the Endurance's stern post, and water began flooding the vessel. The crew immediately set to work, attempting to pump the water out. They persisted for 3 consecutive days, but the water was pouring in faster than they could pump it out. The temperature was -8.5 degrees Celsius, yet the crew remained neither fearful nor panicked. Some tried to alleviate the pressure on the ship by breaking up the surrounding ice floe, but this too proved unsuccessful. The water continued to flood into the ship at an alarming rate, while the pressure from the surrounding ice showed no signs of abating. Finally, Shackleton relented and ordered the crew to abandon the vessel and disembark. Reflecting on their dire situation, one crew member, Tom McLeod, remarked that none of them would ever return home. The Endurance had been trapped in the ice for over 9 months. On the 27th of October, 1915, a loud explosion was heard. When Shackleton turned to look, he witnessed a truly shocking sight. The stern of the ship suddenly rose 20 feet into the air. The rudder and stern posts shattered, and the wooden structure of the ship began to disintegrate. The bow filled with water. Fortunately, by this time, the crew had already evacuated the vessel. Soon after, the water inside the ship froze, and the added weight caused the bow to sink further. As the Endurance sank, so too did Shackleton's dream of crossing Antarctica on foot. However, a far more critical concern now emerged. Could they return alive? The crew had no radio, no telephone, and no means of contacting the outside world. They were stranded on a floating ice floe in the Antarctic Ocean. On this floe, a large iceberg provided a site for the crew to establish their camp. Their first task was to take inventory of their possessions. What did they have? How much food and water remained? They discovered they had 3 small boats and a single sledge for moving across the ice floe. They also had some essential personal belongings and supplies sufficient for approximately 1 month, food for just 1 month. Sleeping space was limited, forcing many to sleep directly on the ice. Most huddled close together to avoid freezing. The likelihood of a passing ship spotting them was nearly non-existent, as they were in the Antarctic Ocean, a region other ships dared not venture into. Over a year had passed since they last saw other humans. The rest of the world had no knowledge of whether they were alive or dead. They could send no messages and expected no assistance. Shackleton had only one asset, his faith in his skills and experience. But how long could this faith sustain him and his crew? What would they do once their food ran out? Camping on the ice was not a sustainable solution, as the floe could break apart at any moment. They desperately needed to reach land. Shackleton made his calculations and estimates, determining that the nearest land was Paulet Island, approximately 550 kilometers away across the icy sea. Located at the tip of Antarctica, this island, ironically, held rescue equipment left behind in 1903 after a Swedish ship became stranded. Those supplies had been purchased by Shackleton himself, and 12 years later, he now found himself in dire need of them. The crew collectively decided to attempt to reach Paulet Island, carrying their belongings on the sledge. Shackleton ordered that each person could bring up to 2 pounds of essential items. Many had brought personal belongings from the ship, but Shackleton reminded them that nothing was more valuable than their lives. He left behind gold coins and his Bible in the snow. The photographer, Frank Hurley, had taken around 400 photographs, but due to the 2-pound limit, he could only carry 150 negatives. These 150 images later provided the world with a visual record of this historic ordeal. After a few weeks, due to dwindling food supplies, the crew was forced to kill the puppies that had lived with them, as they had nothing else to eat. After several days of preparation, the crew loaded their supplies onto the boats and sledges. Each boat weighed approximately 1 ton, making them difficult to haul. Luck was not on their side. By this time, summer had returned to Antarctica, raising temperatures and softening the surface of the ice floe, which made dragging the supplies even more challenging. After 3 hours of grueling effort, the crew looked back to find they had covered only 1 mile. The path ahead grew increasingly treacherous. Shackleton decided to set up camp there, hoping the ice floe would drift closer to land. The floe where they established their camp was later named Ocean Camp. To prevent boredom or depression, Shackleton assigned tasks to every crew member, ensuring they remained occupied. On the 21st of November, 1915, the pressure on the stern of the Endurance intensified to such an extent that the ship began to rise above the water. For a brief moment, it hung in the air before sinking completely beneath the ice. The crew, positioned just a few kilometers away, witnessed the entire event. Although they had already abandoned the ship, watching it sink in this manner left a profound emotional impact, as if their final connection to the world had been severed. All that remained was the ice floe and the ocean camp they had established upon it. For the next few days, things proceeded relatively smoothly. However, after a few weeks, the ice floe began drifting eastward, away from land. Consequently, on the 23rd of December, 1915, Shackleton decided to abandon ocean camp and attempt to march once more. After covering just a few kilometers, they suddenly encountered thin ice and open water, preventing them from moving forward or retreating. Once again, they set up camp on this ice floe. Due to the severe shortage of food, Shackleton imposed strict rationing measures. Each crew member received 1 biscuit per day, some diluted milk, a bit of cocoa, and a small portion of high-fat meat paste from the tins they carried. Additionally, the crew began hunting seals and penguins they could find. Despite the dire food scarcity, Shackleton repeatedly misled his crew about the available supplies to maintain their morale. "Don't worry, lads," he would say. "There's enough food to keep us alive." He knew that surviving this ordeal would require considerable time. Above all, what they needed most was mental fortitude. This principle applies to us as well, friends. Overcoming most challenges demands mental strength. For several months, the crew lived in this new camp. Fortunately, the ice floe began drifting in the right direction. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Finally, a new year began. On the morning of the 23rd of March, 1916, Shackleton glimpsed something through the fog. As the fog cleared, they could see mountains. Shackleton recognized them as Joinville Island. However, spotting Joinville Island was not particularly encouraging, as it was located at the far tip of the Antarctic peninsula. This meant they had drifted so far on the ice floe that they had passed Paulet Island. Joinville Island was only 57 miles from Paulet Island, but to the west, at a 90-degree angle, lay a vast expanse of ice that was nearly impossible to cross. Shackleton returned to his map. He could see that if they continued drifting northward, only 2 islands lay in their path, Clarence Island and Elephant Island. Beyond that, there was nothing but open water for thousands of kilometers, an ocean with waves so high that their chances of survival would drop to near zero. The waters between the southernmost tip of South America and the northernmost tip of Antarctica are known as the Drake Passage, the most treacherous body of water in the world, with waves reaching heights of up to 12 meters. Over 20,000 sailors have lost their lives in the Drake Passage, and over the years, at least 800 ships have sunk there. Friends, even today, in the year 2025, attempting to cross the Drake Passage by ship would reveal such perilous scenes. The Drake Passage can shake even the largest cruise liners. Shackleton knew that if they reached the Drake Passage while drifting on the ice floe, they would all perish. Meanwhile, the food shortage grew dire. The meat scraps originally intended for the dogs were now consumed by the crew, who selected the least spoiled portions. To obtain potable water, each person carried a small tin filled with ice close to their body, using their body heat to melt it and produce a few tablespoons of clean drinking water at a time. An intriguing detail is that, although the crew consisted of 28 members, officially, there were supposed to be only 27. In August 1914, when the ship departed Britain, the 28th member, Blackborough, had stowed away. Shackleton had previously rejected Blackborough's inclusion in the crew, but he sneaked aboard. When discovered, Shackleton bluntly told him that if food ran out, he would be the first to be eaten. Fortunately, Shackleton's crew never reached that point. They were lucky enough one day to spot a sea lion, which they hunted, yielding roughly 1,000 pounds of meat. Additionally, several crew members killed their dogs for food. For the next few months, this ensured there was no immediate food shortage. On the 7th of April, 1916, while drifting on the ice floe, the crew finally sighted Clarence Island, estimated to be about 83 kilometers to the north. This sighting rekindled their hope. However, the wind direction suddenly shifted, blowing eastward where no islands or land existed. Within hours, Shackleton and his crew lost all hope. The ice floe hosting their camp was shrinking, now measuring only 50 meters across, making it increasingly dangerous to remain. Shackleton decided to load the crew into the 3 small boats and head toward Clarence Island. They faced not only open water, but also other ice floes and icebergs. Mid-journey, they encountered another solid ice floe, where they set up a new camp. No sooner had they established it than a crack began forming in the floe. By chance, one crew member, the fireman Ernie Holness, fell into the water. The others quickly tried to pull him out, but before they could catch their breath, the ice floe split in 2. Shackleton was left alone on one fragment, while the rest of the crew drifted away into the darkness on the other. No one knew what to do. Their leader, who had guided them for so long, had vanished into the darkness. Fortunately, they heard Shackleton's voice calling out, "Bring a boat." Some crew members rowed to retrieve him. After reuniting with his crew, Shackleton's first concern was Holness, who was shivering uncontrollably. Having fallen into the frigid water, he was at high risk of hypothermia. With no means to start a fire, immediate action was critical to prevent his death. Drawing on his skills and experience, Shackleton ordered Holness to keep walking until his clothes dried from his body heat. The poor man walked through the night, and eventually, this effort dried his clothes, alleviating the extreme cold he felt. Meanwhile, the winds continued to shift repeatedly, causing the ice floe to drift in one direction and then another. The crew changed their target 4 times. Initially, they believed they would reach Clarence Island, then thought it might be King George Island, and even considered Hope Bay. Ultimately, they decided to head for Elephant Island, the last island before the Drake Passage. It lay 160 kilometers to the northwest. As the iceberg was already drifting northward, temperatures were slowly rising, reaching -8 degrees Celsius. The ice cover around them was thinning. However, this also meant their supply of fresh water was dwindling. They were nearly out of water, with everyone's lips swollen and cracked from thirst. Their throats were so dry that swallowing food became difficult. The crew resorted to eating raw seal meat, which was easier to swallow with its blood. Meanwhile, the ice floe was slowly drifting toward Elephant Island, bringing them within 50 kilometers of their destination. Shackleton ordered all 3 boats to be lowered into the water, as this final leg of their journey would be by sea. On the 15th of April, 1916, the crew could scarcely believe their fate. After 497 days at sea, the 3 boats safely reached Elephant Island, and the crew finally stood on solid ground. After enduring hell, this desolate, uninhabited rocky mass felt nothing short of paradise. They could hardly believe their feet were on solid land, not ice. The crew was overjoyed, but unbeknownst to them, their troubles were far from over. Blackborough, one of the crew members, lost the use of his legs, and another, Rickenson, suffered a heart attack upon reaching the island, but miraculously survived. The greater problem was that Elephant Island was completely uninhabited. No humans lived there, and it lacked rescue supplies or any means of communication with the outside world. Situated in a remote location, no ships passed by. Their predicament remained unchanged. How could they return home? Consulting the map, Shackleton identified 3 options. The first was to head to Cape Horn, the southernmost tip of South America, roughly 800 kilometers to the northwest. The second was to aim for the Falkland Islands, about 880 kilometers east of South America. The third option was to seek help from South Georgia Island, 1,300 kilometers to the northeast. The first 2 options were closer, but both required crossing the Drake Passage. Shackleton chose the third option, believing the sea and wind conditions would be more favorable for reaching South Georgia Island. The crew was too exhausted to undertake the journey as a whole, so Shackleton decided to take a small team of 5 men to sail to South Georgia Island. Once there, they would request assistance from a ship. The remaining crew would establish a camp on Elephant Island. On the 24th of April, 1916, Shackleton and his team of 5 set out for South Georgia Island. Their planned route, as shown on the map, could not entirely avoid the Drake Passage. They had to cross it to reach the island, with no better alternative available. In their small rowboat, they ventured into the world's most dangerous waters. To cover such a long distance, they took turns rowing for 4 hours and resting for 4. But rest was hardly possible in the cramped boat, where they were battered by waves, seasick, and exhausted. In April, winter begins in Antarctica, with the sun visible for only a few hours each day, leaving them in darkness for over 20 hours. Those brief hours of sunlight were critical, as only then could they use the sextant to navigate and confirm they were heading in the right direction. They sailed for hours, which turned into days. Water constantly entered the boat, and they worked tirelessly to pump it out. At times, waves were so massive they nearly capsized the vessel. For a moment, it seemed the boat would not survive, but by sheer luck, they persevered. They had some food on board, but space on the deck was so limited that they couldn't sit upright to eat, forcing them to lie down to consume their meals. The conditions in the boat were so grueling that even Shackleton's courage began to waver. The strain became overwhelming, and when a bird circled their boat, he lashed out at it in frustration, his pent-up anguish eroding his resolve. In the end, after days of sailing, they neared their destination, just 3 miles from South Georgia Island. But before they could celebrate, a sudden sea storm struck, trapping their boat in its fury. The waves became uncontrollable, tossing the boat up and down. Exhausted, the men set down their oars and surrendered to the storm's mercy. For hours, the tempest flung their boat about. When the winds finally calmed and the clouds began to clear, they caught sight of South Georgia Island, now only 1 mile away. With renewed determination, they mustered their remaining strength and rowed furiously. The waves remained formidable, and Shackleton felt the end was near. The boat seemed almost stationary, but slowly and steadily, they inched closer to the island. After battling storms, winds, and waves for 3 consecutive weeks, on the 10th of May, 1916, they finally set foot on South Georgia Island, the same island from which they had embarked on their Antarctic journey 522 days earlier. A wave of joy swept over them. Shackleton and his crew embraced one another. However, their ordeal was far from over. South Georgia Island stretches over 100 kilometers, and the shore they landed on was on the opposite side of the human settlement. On the map, the whaling station and human settlement lay directly across the island. They faced 2 options to reach the whaling station: return to the boat and sail 130 miles by sea to the northern side of the island, or trek 29 miles overland. The problem was that South Georgia Island's mountains were so treacherous that no one in history had ever crossed the island on foot. It was deemed impossible. Naturally, they initially chose the boat, but as expected, another obstacle emerged. Their boat had been so badly damaged by the violent waves that it was no longer seaworthy. They had no choice but to walk. The alternative was to attempt the crossing of the island. No one had ever crossed South Georgia. Whalers considered the interior inaccessible, Shackleton noted. Yet, he was not one to give up, especially not at this point. After enduring so much over the past year, surrender was not an option. To survive, they now faced a challenge no human had ever attempted: crossing snow-covered mountains rising 10,000 feet. Shackleton first decided to rest and regain their strength. For the next 9 days, they stayed in a cave, eating well, as the island teemed with albatross, seals, and penguins, ensuring no shortage of food. On the 19th of May, 1916, at around 3 in the morning, they set out from King Haakon Bay. Shackleton was accompanied by only 2 crew members, Worsley and Crean. Worsley and Crean were coming with me. After consultation, we decided to leave our sleeping bags behind and make the journey in very light marching order, he recorded. Their first challenge was that no one knew where to go or how to proceed. The snow reached their knees, and the mountains were so high they couldn't see beyond them. They climbed one mountain after another, searching for a path from the summits. When no path was found, they retreated and tried another. This happened several times. They scaled every mountain in sight, encountering deep valleys on some and sheer rock walls on others. Each time they found no way forward, they descended and attempted another peak. When the fog lifted completely, we saw, to our bitter disappointment, that what we thought was a frozen lake was an arm of the sea. Shackleton recounted firmly, saying, "We must go to the next mountain, boys." This occurred 3 times. Over the next few days, they climbed all the surrounding mountains. Even after scaling the final peak, they found nothing new, only a deep valley with a steep, dangerous slope. The outlook was gloomy enough, fog barred our retreat, and darkness shrouded our advance, Shackleton wrote. It was pointless to continue this way, Shackleton concluded. By this time, retreat was no longer an option. They tied themselves together with rope and began carving steps into the mountain, literally chiseling a path to descend. After some time, they caught sight of the Stromness whaling station and other people. After 36 hours of climbing, on the 20th of May, 1916, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean successfully crossed the Allardyce Range and reached the Stromness whaling station. This marked the first time in history that South Georgia Island had been traversed on foot. The magnitude of their seemingly impossible achievement is underscored by the fact that it was not replicated until 1955, and then only by expert mountaineers with full preparation. Shackleton's team had no tents or sleeping bags, only courage, determination, and sheer willpower. When Shackleton and his companions finally arrived at the whaling station, they were barely recognizable as human. Their beards had grown long, their faces were darkened, with only their eyes visible, and their clothes were completely tattered. Eventually, the station manager recognized them, identifying Shackleton as the man who had disappeared with his crew in Antarctica 2 years prior. Everyone at South Georgia Island knew of Shackleton's tragic tale, the man presumed dead with his ship. They could hardly believe he stood before them after 2 years. The manager immediately provided them with food, new clothes, and beds. The 3 men bathed and shaved. The next day, Worsley sailed to King Haakon Bay to rescue their 3 remaining companions waiting on the other side of the island. Shackleton's primary concern now was the 22 crew members stranded on Elephant Island. Over a month had passed since he last saw them. Were they still alive? In such desperate conditions, could one remain motivated enough to survive, especially without knowing whether their leader had succeeded in crossing the Drake Passage or if help was coming? On the other hand, would anyone come to rescue them? Share your honest thoughts in the comments below. How long could you survive in such conditions? Shackleton worked tirelessly to rescue his crew from Elephant Island as quickly as possible. However, when he arrived with another ship, it became trapped in the ice. He tried again, but the second attempt failed as well. The same happened on his 3rd try. Over 3 months, he made 3 attempts to reach Elephant Island, but each time, he was forced to turn back. As time passed, Shackleton's anxiety grew. He urgently requested an icebreaker from the British government and was granted a ship named Discovery, but it would take weeks to arrive. Shackleton was not in the mood to wait, uncertain of how long his crew could hold out. He then requested another ship from the Chilean government, which provided the Yelcho. On the 20th of August, 1916, he set out for Elephant Island once more. It took approximately 6 days, but this time, on the 30th of August, he successfully reached Elephant Island. He was stunned by what he saw. Shackleton had known the 22 men left behind would need leadership to avoid succumbing to depression and despair. Thus, he appointed Frank Wild as their leader. Under Wild's command, The men constructed a shelter by overturning the two boats. They survived there for 128 days, hunting penguins and seals for sustenance. Amid cold, hunger, and frustration, Wilde repeated the same phrase every morning: "Pack your bags, friends. The boss may come today." The boss referred to Shackleton. But the boss did not come. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Yet every morning, Wilde rose and repeated, "Pack your bags, friends. The boss may come today." Each morning, he climbed a hill to check for a ship, and each evening, he returned disappointed. After 4 months, the men's resolve began to waver. Conditions grew increasingly dire. Blackborough's leg developed a severe infection, gangrene, forcing the crew to amputate it. With each passing day, they grew more convinced that Shackleton had not reached South Georgia Island. Perhaps their boat had sunk en route. 4 months and 6 days had passed since Shackleton's departure. Frank Wilde decided to press forward. Under his orders, the crew began packing their bags, not in hopes of rescue this time, but to set sail themselves. They started preparing to depart for Deception Island. However, before they could leave Elephant Island, they spotted something in the distance on the sea, a massive ship approaching. It was the Elcho. As it drew closer, they could make out their leader, Shackleton, aboard. From the man on watch outside, we heard a sudden cry, "Wilde!" He shouted, "Wilde! There's a ship. Shouldn't we light a flare?" Their boss had finally arrived to rescue them. Shackleton was astounded to see them. All 22 men were alive. They had not given up. After battling ice, mountains, and oceans for nearly 2 years, Shackleton and his crew returned home. When we arrived, they welcomed us so warmly that they nearly pushed us back into the sea, he recalled. It was truly a miracle. Shackleton had set out with 27 men and returned with all 27, including the stowaway Blackborough. This was only possible due to Shackleton's leadership and courage, the crew's unwavering determination, and their unbreakable teamwork. Friends, 106 years after this ordeal, in 2022, researchers conducting studies in the sea discovered Shackleton's ship, the Endurance, in the Weddell Sea, 10,000 feet below the surface. The state of preservation is absolutely astonishing. There are no marine parasites consuming the wood in the Weddell Sea, they noted. Remarkably, it took 106 years to locate the wreck, and despite the passage of time, its proximity to Antarctica left it in exceptionally good condition. You can see the latest images of the ship on the screen, captured just a few years ago. Today, if you visit South Georgia Island, you will find Shackleton's grave there. He had set out to achieve a historic feat, to be the first to cross Antarctica on foot. Though his original plan failed, he accomplished something far more miraculous and awe-inspiring. Friends, if you enjoyed this survival story, another equally astonishing tale is that of the survivors of Flight 571. It's another story that demonstrates how, with determination, courage, and strong will, the impossible can become possible. Thank you so much.